Hello, good evening, and welcome to a very special edition of the Comix Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club Masterpiece Edition. I'm Brian Hibbs. I'm your host. I'm the owner of Comix Experience. We love comics at Comix Experience. We love great comics. We love talking about comics. And so we have these three clubs, if you include the kids club, which you should, where we pick great books and we bring the authors in and we talk to them. And it's great. And we have a really special show tonight. We're I perhaps foolishly booked three people each of whom I could probably talk to solo for 2 hours at a time. And we're going to try and get all of them in here and see where this goes. This should be a really good conversation about comics, about Vertigo comics in particular, and about our pick this month, which you can see from behind me, but I'm going to hold it up, which is Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes. We are very, very lucky here to have Neil Gaiman, Paul Levitz, and Karen Berger. Welcome to you, my lovely panel and my good friends.
Hello, hello. It's great to
Pleasure
be
to be
here.
here.
It is so good to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this, Brian.
So the first question I always ask, and I this is going to be really good because the three of you I think are going to give me very, very, very different answers. The first question always is, why comics? Of all the things that you can be doing, that you could have involved your life in, what is it about comics that is special? That sings to you, that speaks to your soul. Karen, you're in the top corner, so why don't you start?
Sure. I think my answer is probably going to be different from Paul's and Neil's, is because for me, being in comics was at first just a job. And, I had graduated from college. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with my life. Majored in English, had a lot of art history and journalism background. And I just kind of fell into it. And I had read comics since I was a kid, but I quickly fell in love with, the medium and the collaborative aspect of it, the creativity. And DC was such a great place to work back then. And, I'm more surprised than anybody that I wound up being in comics and what has become a quote unquote lifetime career.
Very good. Paul?
Yeah.
Same question.
I was a reader of everything when I was a kid. I had a particular fondness for comics and the imagination and the fact that there were all these strange worlds, all these complex mythologies, particularly the old Mort Weisinger edited Superman family of titles, the Legion of Superheroes with one strange planet name after another, one strange superpower. I think of it as really parallel to why I saw at least one of my kids fall in love with Pokemon, that there was just a body of secret knowledge that you could accumulate. The Charmander turns into Charlizard, turns into Charpuppy or something like that. For me, it was the Legionnaires, where they came from. And I also wasn't planning to spend my life in this, but it was going to be a great way to work my way through school. And it was just so much fun. I never left. Never got any honest work.
Very good. Neil, how about you?
I loved comics as a kid. I loved comics in a different way. When I turned, 10 or 11, and started finding the DC Comics sort of weird titles. Swamp Thing. I often feel like the English shilling that I borrowed from my dad to buy Swamp Thing #1 with was the best investment he ever made in my education. running into a Brave and the Bold with the Phantom Stranger, and it tumbled me into Phantom Stranger. And at that point, I realized I loved Len's writing. And I had lots of writers who I loved out there in the world before, but Len first, and then I think Archie Goodwin very soon after, were the first times that I actually went, I really like your writing. I like what you're doing here. There's something really interesting happening. And so at that point, I would have been, I don't know, 13, 14, I decided I want to write comics. And I very rapidly, having inquired from the school careers advisor how you write comics, was told that you can't, you don't. Writing American comics is not something that you will ever be able to do. And I became a journalist, but I became a journalist with a secret passion for a dream that one day I could write comics. And I'd stopped reading comics at that point, except for Will Eisner. I would go and get Spirit reprints. And then, which meant that I missed a lot of the interesting stuff that was happening in the very early 80s. Then I picked up a Warrior, went, this is really interesting, picked up a Swamp Thing. I think it was Swamp Thing 23, 24, somewhere around there.
At the train station.
And at the train station, on Victoria Station, when they used to have a W.H. Smith. And that was it for me. I was just like, okay, this thing that I thought was possible is possible. You can write good comics. You can write intelligent comics. And I made contact with Alan Moore. Alan showed me how to physically write a script. I wrote a couple. I think I don't know if I gave both of them to Karen when she was over at UCAC, but I was there as a journalist interviewing Alan and Dave Gibbons, and I just went up to Karen very nervously and I said, script. And that was how it all began.
Yeah. So let's start maybe with Karen. You going to UCAC. It seems like it was one of the big catalysts for sort of everything that happened, right? Other American editors weren't coming to the UK and seeing people. How did that start for you?
Well, actually, Jeanette Kahn had been going to UCAP for several years before she asked me to. What is that? That wasn't me. before she asked me to accompany her, like a week before UCAC one year. She said we were at an editorial retreat up in the mountains, which Jeanette and Paul and Dick Giordano used to do a couple of times a year with the editor. Only a handful of us at the time, and Bruce Bristow around marketing, and Richard, Richard Burning, my husband, for people out there who don't know Richard. And I forget that we're talking in front of there are actual people listening to this, as opposed to just a few of us sitting around talking. But anyway, Richard, who is the art director, design director at DC, but also involved in the ambiance of the times. So anyway, so Jeanette had asked me, hey, I'm going to UCAC next week. I go every year, and Jeanette always would throw these parties, which were kind of notorious for these really fancy places like the Savoy and a place in Hyde Park as well, too, which people always had a lot of great stories about. But anyway, so Jeanette said, hey, I'm going to UCAC. Do you want to come with me? I'm like, yeah, sure. So before I knew it, I was there. And I had already been working with Alan on Swamp Thing for several years. This was 86. It was 1986. And I'd already been working with Alan, and I had known Dave Gibbons and Brian Mullen fairly well because they were, Brian and Dave, actually Brian was the first British freelancer to come over. And that was a big deal back then. And so he came over, and then Dave came over a few times, and I became friendly with them. And Jeanette said, hey, working with Alan, Brian and Dave and a few other British artists, I believe, and writers. I think at that time, Cam Kennedy and Jim Bakey were doing work on Grand, and John Wagner, I think, had just started writing. I don't know, it wasn't Batman. I don't remember. Paul, you probably remember this better than I do. But there was sort of a small circle of all the 2000 ID guys were starting to write comics for DC. And that was a big deal. And that was all Jeanette's, really from all Jeanette's connections. And so Jeanette was like, hey, why don't you come over? Could be our ambassador, DC ambassador with the British talent. A lot of them feel that they don't hear from their editors much. And obviously this was like in the Stone Age. No FedEx, no email. It was just, dialing the phone. And, and a lot of DC editors just didn't want to dial those extra 4 digits or whatever the hell, 6 digits. Anyway, to make a long story short, I went over there, and I sort of, it was kind of common sense that, hey, there's such a pool of untapped talent here that we're not working with. We had just started working with sort of the well-known British writers and artists, but I saw that there was, a bunch of younger writers and artists about my age who were just starting out, and I'm like, why don't we take a chance on them? And that's kind of how that started too, I guess. So so it also kind of started with UCAC. So I kind of put out the word, hey, I'm looking for new writers and artists. And it was also, this was the late 80s. So when I came over, I really didn't come over as liaison until like 87 or so, technically. And that was, as we know, the time of Watchmen and Dark Knight.
Sure.
And George Perez had just done a new Wonder Woman, which I was the editor of. John Byrne had just done a new Superman. So DC, was riding high in terms of reinventing the flagship characters for the time. Watchmen, of course, is in a class of its own. So it was a good time for me to say to people, hey, this before creator-owned deals. How do we, we got all these kind of weird supernatural horror characters, and none of the other DC editors wanted to do anything with them. So I was like, hey, why don't I go out there and see what some new writers and artists would want to do? And many of them had the same interests. I met some. So that's kind of how that started in a roundabout way.
Yeah. And Neil, like that early pitching, did it feel like it was actually plausible that you'd be able to sell a script to DC at that point in your career, or was it kind of hope and prayer?
I had a secret weapon, which was Dave McKean. And I knew how good Dave was. And Dave and I had met on a comic that wasn't happening. But we'd liked each other, and I'd gone, oh my God, you're brilliant. He'd started working on Violent Cases, which meant that when Karen and Dick and Jeanette came over on their search for British talent, at I think the end of 86, I got to turn up with Dave. And Dave got to show them his pages from Violent Cases. And Dave was convinced that this was going to be a complete bust because he'd already gone over on his own dime to New York, kind of gone to DC and Marvel, and they'd just given him a weird look, and he'd gone away again. But we were in there. I pitched a Phantom Stranger story, and to Karen, who said, "That's funny. Grant Morrison was in here this morning, and he pitched a Phantom Stranger story too." And we said no to him too, because somebody else is doing it. So out of that, that little talent run that morning, they got Animal Man and Black Orchid.
Yeah. And
then Karen phoned me when I was writing the last episode of Black Orchid. I was writing the last issue, and she said, "Look, we're a bit worried because it's a character that nobody's ever heard of, done by two guys nobody's ever heard of, and it's a female character of that, and they don't really sell. So we thought that we'd give Dave this Arkham Asylum comic to do, and we'd let you do something too, and that way you'll get names. You'll at least be known when we release Black Orchid." And of course, as it happened, Black Orchid came out before Arkham, and Black Orchid came out, a month before Sandman. But that was where the Sandman conversation came from with Karen, where I just said, I remember listing characters I liked to her, and she said no to each one of them because somebody else was doing the Forever People or the Demon or whatever. All of the things I pitched. And at the end, when I ran out of air, she said, "What about that Sandman thing you were telling me and Jeanette about when we had dinner? You said you wanted to do something with the Jack Kirby Sandman." And I said, "Oh yeah, I do." And she said, "Great, so do that, but just don't make it the Kirby Sandman. Make it your own." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And that was how hard pitching Sandman was.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
When you got that pitch, Karen, when you received it, what'd you think? Like, what was obviously you published it, so you liked it, but
yeah, no, I thought it was really good. I thought it was really good. I wasn't blown away, to be honest. I thought it had a lot of potential.
I just want to say here, one of the things that I love best about this is Karen was always, through our editorial relationship, the most honest editor I ever dealt with. If she didn't like something, she'd tell me. If she didn't think something was great, she'd tell, it was like, if she loved something, she'd tell me, but she was like one of those teachers who were hard grade, but when you get an A, you got an A. So I handed in the Sandman outline to her, and then I got a phone call from her a couple of days later, and she said, "Well, I don't like it." She said, "No, I like it. There's a lot of good stuff here." I don't. You did. You said what you said was you said there's a lot of good stuff in here. No, you absolutely didn't say you didn't like it. You said there's a lot of good stuff in here. I don't think it works yet. You said, and then there was a beat, and then you said, "But Jeanette asked to see it, and I sent it down to her, and she loves it. So we're doing it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, bless her, Jeanette.
Pretty much.
And I've never known that happen with anything else or anyone else, that Jeanette was interested, asked for the outline, and basically just rubber stamped it. So, and I wasn't ready for prime time. I mean, that's the amazing thing about the whole of Sandman. I had no idea what I was doing, at least for the first year. All I'm doing is going, "Oh my gosh, I have to write a monthly comic. I have no idea how to write a monthly comic. I've sold 4 short stories and 5 Future Shocks, and what the hell? Okay, starting here." And I had Karen to hold my hand, which was amazing. I had Dave doing the covers, which was amazing. And I learned on the job. I'm still not sure, going back to that original outline, that I would have given me that job. But I'm so...
No, it was really good. No, it was really good. But I think my hesitation at the time was that you were always a really good talker, Neil, but I wasn't sure that I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be. I wasn't quite sure that you would deliver what you wound up doing. I mean, no one, I think, ever thought that, let alone yourself, probably. And we forget at the time we were all really young doing this stuff. I mean, I was pretty young too. I'm only 2 years older than you, Neil, even though you always thought I was so much older than you. I'm not.
You were a grown-up.
I pretended to be, yeah. And so, yeah, it's just it was a different world back then. And I will say that Paul was really young when you first started DC. Jeanette was really young. We were all, got into our positions at a fairly young age by today's standards in terms of, a professional responsibility and all that stuff, So when you think about it,
yeah,
I guess some people trusted us, right? Paul, you trusted me, so for the most part.
We were making it up as we went along. And,
right.
Mercifully, we had good instincts. And between the bunch of us, there was enough skill and enough common sense to make it work.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Paul, about was sort of the culture of DC being in that weird place of being sort of caretakers of Batman and Superman and what we all knew they meant to culture. And then also really, really, really wanting to do something more than that. I mean, a lot of people who are watching this probably don't remember the DC slogan at one point was DC Comics, they're not for kids anymore. And so I wonder if you can maybe talk about that tension between the two things you were trying to accomplish.
Well, there really isn't. I wouldn't describe it as a tension, Brian. I used to describe DC to our owners as a self-financing R&D company. And if you thought of it with the metaphor of a pharma company, had these couple of wonder drugs in Superman and Batman that were just insanely valuable, but you also had to keep them fresh to be able to keep them under patent and keep them wonderful. If you didn't do new stories, if you didn't bring in a John Byrne, or you didn't bring in a Frank Miller doing something on Batman, or Alan on the couple of very important Batman things he did, those drugs would grow stale. They'd be passed by the current stuff. And at the same time, we wanted to create the things that would be the future of the company. And when you do that, like with real R&D, the vast majority of things you do don't work out. They cure one patient here or there, or they entertain, in the case of comics, they entertain a kid here or there, but they don't become part of the culture. But you have to be willing to take chances and experiment. And we had a great run of it, particularly in the 80s. And Watchmen, Sandman represent two of the real wonder drugs that came out of that period of experimentation that really have gone on to be so important to the future of the company. And, it wasn't like we necessarily knew exactly how they each get made. The pile of unmade Sandman movie scripts be quite a frightening volume if you put them all together from our efforts on all of that. But now it's coming together in yet another form. The pile of unmade Watchmen scripts before the movie was made would frighten the life out of anybody in the film industry. And the film itself, I think, was wonderful on some level, but was not wonderful commercially. But the TV series that followed it, which took it off in a whole other direction, became culturally very important. So you create these children and you don't know what they're going to do when they grow up.
Yeah.
And you're not even necessarily going to be there when they grow up. But you hope that you're leaving a legacy that will have real value for the future. And I'm very proud of the fact, looking backwards, that so much of what we did in those years became culturally important, either in the books, the comics themselves, the graphic novel forms that emerged from it, or the transmediated television or film versions that have brought forward.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I always admire you, Paul, was that you did keep a distance between the transmedia and the comics, and you kept them a bit apart, you know. And I think that right now, sometimes the cart's leading the horse, unfortunately. But
Well, I mean,
Sandman,
that
go ahead.
you know, that's the whole issue of whether there's really two ways to do R&D. Classically, one version of it is pure research and development, and you have the university or the lab on the hill, and you tell the scientists, just go fuck around with whatever you want to do, have a great time, and maybe something will be useful. And that's the Bell Laboratories. That was Xerox's Park Laboratory that invented the mouse. And a lot of the time when you do that, the company that is funding it doesn't get much use out of it. The other, we put the R&D right next to the factory, and you say, look, we're doing applied R&D. The guys from the factory are going to come over and say, we need a better way to make these dust busters stronger. What can you guys come with? And the decision to move DC to California and nest it more firmly within the film and television divisions, really was a decision to make it more of an applied research and development company rather than a pure research and development company. You can argue for either of those. I was real happy running the pure research, and that was the version I was interested in doing. The other one, you know, that's okay. It's your company. You can do it however you want.
Absolutely. To keep with that metaphor, I mean, I would say that Sandman, in a certain way, is very much as pure of a research as you can, because the only thing it really has in common with the two previous iterations of the character is the name, essentially. Neil, how did you make the jump from you know, the gas mask Sandman, the Kirby Sandman to Dream?
Honestly, it was just Karen saying to me, make it your own.
Okay.
That was, and I suddenly went, oh, great. Okay, I have a blank slate. I have this idea, and the idea was simply King of Dreams. I always thought it was weird that the Sandman in the Fleischer, Kirby, Simon comic only ever showed up in the dreams of one kid. And I'm like, that's weird. Shouldn't he be in everybody's dreams? Shouldn't he be the king of all dreams? Shouldn't he be running it? Well, maybe. And my idea at the time was just, okay, well, maybe that's how this one kid sees him, but he's much more interesting than that. So starting with a blank page, it was me taking incredibly realistic stock of my talents and going, okay, I don't think I'm very good at superheroes. I love superheroes, but I don't have when I watch Alan, when I watch Grant Morrison, when I watch people who do superheroes, there's something that I don't do there. But I love the thing that Roger Zelazny did in his book, Lord of Light, where he had people who were gods. And it felt like superheroes. It had all of that kind of thing going for it. And maybe I can do God comics. And I think I'm probably better at fantasy and horror. And at least I love what Alan's been doing in Swamp Thing. So I'll start there. And then I have to go, okay, well, if this is the King of Dreams, how come we haven't seen him so far? I want this thing to be in the DC universe because I loved the DC universe. I loved Swamp Thing. I loved Phantom Stranger. I loved this wonderful big mad world. So I thought, well, he's obviously been in prison for 80 years, and now he's through the whole DC universe, and now he's going to get out. And that gave me something. And then I was just sitting looking at my book of quotations, and I just looked up sleep, and the third or fourth quotation just said, sleep is the brother of death. And I thought, that's really interesting. So death is Dream's brother? Might be cool if death was Dream's sister. I could do that. And suddenly I had a family. And and there was just this starting out feeling of I can do anything. Nobody, and also very, very specifically, let's talk about what Paul was saying on R&D. One of the things that DC was doing during that particular period, and it's not true at other periods of DC's history, but it was true right then, was Comix got 12 issues.
Yeah.
They were letting things run for 12 issues. They were planning for 12 issues. The idea was that 12 issues was long enough either to get an audience or to fail to get an audience. I knew that I was writing something that in my heart, I was trying to write something that would be a critical success. And in comics at that point, critical success had mostly been synonymous with commercial failure, which meant that probably I would get 12 issues. Probably at issue 8, somebody would phone me up. Karen would phone me up and say, nobody's really buying it, but we love you. Take it to issue 12 and we're done. And we'll find something else for you. That was how I figured it would go. So I plotted an 8-issue storyline. And I went, great, 8 issues. That'll be my storyline. And then I'll do 4 short stories, take my hat off, say, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This was the Sandman. And people will remember it fondly. And then also, because you can't just do that, there was a little part of my brain that went, but if by some amazing fluke we survive, I'm going to build this in and this in and this in and this in and this in. So they'll all be there for me when I need them. And I'm going to do all of this secret stuff that I'm going to plan. And I won't even tell Karen because she'll think I'm nuts. Because I'm actually going to try and do this. Well, because the stuff that I was going to try and do all involved telling a story and finishing a story, which now sounds so utterly logical. And then I just remember the first time I ever broke to Karen that was what I was planning to do. And she was lovely and explained why it didn't work that way. And I didn't even argue. I just sort of went, okay, let's have this conversation again in a few years' time. And I didn't even say that. I just thought that. And a few years' time, as we were finishing, maybe a year or two away from finishing Sandman, Karen phoned me up and she said, we can't really carry this thing on once you're done, can we? And I said, no. And she said, let's do the dreaming. And I said, yes. Yeah. And that was the plan.
I mean, in a lot of ways, periodical comics are all middles, right? I mean, even when you look at, say, Lyta, you're telling, she had a story that came before, and you gave it a bit, and theoretically someone else could pick it up later. It's really rare to get the chance to actually build your own mythology within that environment. Yeah.
And that is the amazing, the achievement of DC and of Marvel. Looking back on whatever we're now in 80-something years of comics history, is you have the 2 biggest, and considering that at times that they have crossed over, if you regard them as one thing, you have the biggest work of communal fiction that has probably ever been created by humanity. Yeah. But I love that because that's an awful lot like life. You always come in the middle of people's stories, and you always leave before the end.
Yeah. At what point did you know that you were getting more than your 8 issues and your final 4?
It's funny. I was watching a few nights ago the dailies for the Hell episode. We're shooting a little bit out of order. We did 1 and then 3 and then 1 and then 5 for the Netflix show. So we did episode 1, episode 5, then went back and did 2 and 3, and then we did 7 and 8, and now we've gone back and we're doing 4. So I got to watch the Hell and Gwendolyn Christie as Lucifer, and it was amazing. And I was telling my assistant out here that issue of Sandman, and telling Alan Heinberg, who's showrunning, that issue of Sandman was the lowest selling issue of Sandman ever in history. Yeah. We sold whatever we sold, 60,000 of the first issue, and then it dropped for the second issue, and they dropped their order for the third issue, and they dropped their order for the fourth issue, which I think was like 41,000. It was, and I think the royalty cutoff was 40,000 at that point. So it was down to 41,000. Yeah. And then with issue 5, it went up to 43 or 44. Issue 1 had now come out and people were reacting to it. And then issue 6, we're back to 45. And issue 7, we're at 48. And then I handed in issue 8, the script, and I was very, very unsure, because here was probably the least comic book story I'd ever written. Nothing. It's basically a brother and a sister meet in New York and walk around a bit, and one of them cheers up. And that was the plot.
Yeah.
And I thought Karen wouldn't like it, and she loved it, the script. And then it was drawn, and I thought everybody was going to hate it, and everybody loved it, and they got behind it. And Karen, you have with you the thing that in some ways changed everything.
Yeah.
Here's the camera. Here it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That, and what Paul and Bruce and Karen, and I don't know who actually came up with the idea, was the idea of, they had Sandman 8. They knew they had a sort of little low-level critical hit on their hands. It was now selling. It was getting an audience. And just the idea was they would overprint 25% and send each store 25% more than they had ordered free. And just say, give them out. Do whatever you want to do with these. You can sell them, but we'd love it if you give them away. And the first issue, the one Karen is holding, is actually not the one that was first printed. It's the second printing, but the incredibly rare one, because the first version was printed and they left off the letter on the inside front cover. But the letter also contained the copyright information. So then they had to go back to press for like 5 copies.
Paul, you're on it? I don't remember that.
I remember
there you go.
Neil remembers everything, so so I trust his memory. Yeah.
If you look at that thing, there's a letter from you that you just showed, and then there's the copyright information below. And the issue that came out, they'd forgotten to put that letter in, and of course, which meant that it didn't have any copyright information, which is why I discovered that version existed. And there were however many of them were printed as it takes to put your button on and off the printer, because they only wanted, they needed 5 copies for the Library of Congress or whatever. Right. So I think, a box of 800 of them or whatever was created, and they went out mostly to Comix Experience.
Yeah. My memory of the time was that So first off, the one that you want to say is that the printers that they used to print these things on in Canada were giant, huge things. And literally, if you just press the button on and off, it spits out like 800, 1,000 copies, something like that. I was told that there were 5 cases altogether. I got 2 of those 5 cases. One of them went to the DC offices, and the other 2 went to a different comic shop. And
they went to the Outer Limits.
Oh, this is something special. But the idea was we were supposed to give these things out, right? Neil was coming to do a signing, which was, I believe, your second American signing at our store. This was back in the day before anyone knew who Neil was. Neil actually slept on the couch in my apartment. That would not be a thing that would happen today. We gave them out. We gave them out at barbershops and colleges, and we left them on the bus. And I played Johnny Comic Seed. It was actually so much fun to go because you could read it and you went, this is exactly the kind of comic, even though maybe especially because it's not a typical comic. It's exactly the kind of comic that a civilian would read and go, wait, what is this? I want more of this. And it worked out that way for us, very much so. And it worked nationally as well. I'm wondering, Paul, maybe can you talk just a minute about the impetus about doing an overship on the 8th issue of a comic? I mean, that's highly unusual.
What Neil talked about in terms of we called it the J-hook pattern, was something that we first saw with Teen Titans about 7 or 8 years earlier. Because that really was the amount of time it took a retailer to see, oh, this isn't the thing that we expected it to be. People seem to be enjoying this more. And as we started to hear that buzz, one of the questions was, how do you throw accelerant onto this? We had seen a little bit of that happen with Swamp Thing with Alan. It didn't start with #1, but it was the same sort of thing. It took about 5 or 6 issues for people to figure out that something special was happening. We weren't ready or sophisticated enough to figure out all the right tools for that. But by the time Sandman came along, we were looking for the right opportunities. And part of it was, how do you get the average retailer, Brian not being the average retailer, who was always a very strong supporter of Karen's work and the sort of experiment things that we were doing that would become Vertigo. But how do we get the average retailer to pay some attention to this? And one of the tools was to have a fairly expensive Sandman statue solicited at the same time, because the comic, well, you could look at your numbers for last month and it's doing okay. Let me order 5 copies more than I had last month. But couldn't get you weren't likely to get the average retailer to look at it for more than 2 minutes. I don't remember what the first Sandman statue cost. I think it was $75 or $100, which was an awful lot of money for the comic shop world. Of course, it would be non-returnable, and there really wasn't anything to predict it based on. There had been some statues of some of the characters, but not anything that was as new as Sandman, and not anything that was as different as Sandman. So it really made the average retailer stop and really look at what the numbers had been for Sandman. And that was another piece of trying to goose it along and see, what can we get this up to? How high can we bring this? Interesting
that merchandise was as big of a part of that. I mean, I remember that happening at the time, but I wouldn't have thought that was the thinking.
We haven't really talked much about Bruce Bristow, and Bruce kind of is the mysterious 5th person who should be on this. And Bruce and I butted heads, but he did 2 things that were gloriously right. The first thing happened when Sandman 16 was just about to come out. And Sandman had a buzz by this point. We didn't have a statue. We didn't have anything. We just had a comic, but we had a comic that people were buzzing about. And Michael Gilmore was doing the What's Hot issue of Rolling Stone, and he wrote about Sandman. And Rolling Stone's ad department called Bruce and said, and this is my memory, you have a free advert if you want it.
Yeah.
And Bruce went, well, hang on, we haven't got anything to sell. And suddenly, and we put this book together, in my memory, Karen, is we had 2 weeks to put it together. We were using stock art from the original Doll's House trade paperback. We're using stock over art.
Jordan.
There it is. There we go. That's
was
so
that the ad that we ran in Rolling Stone? Oh, God.
That was the ad that ran in Rolling Stone.
Wow.
And it was Horror Has a New Face, Sandman. And the book existed, so there was something to sell. So that was the incredible speed with which that happened. Bruce, bless him, at the time thought it was a failure, he told me, because I think maybe 2 copies sold through that ad. There was a number you could call and nobody, but it did change everything. And it was the first time anybody had ever done a trade paperback of an ongoing series while it was ongoing. That thing, nobody had ever made the head jump.
Yeah. And when we take that for granted today, because, today, the average viewer of this expects there to be a paperback, right? Like it's actually changed the whole equation of how comics sell, right? Because a lot of people avoid the periodical, the serialization, because they know there's going to be a book. But back in those days, that was not a thing at all. As I recall, DC had maybe a dozen books that were in print at that point. I mean, Watchmen and Dark Knight, certainly.
And they were all from things that had been completed. So they were Watchmen, they were Dark Knight, they were Camelot 3000.
Yep.
They were
maybe Death in the Family.
We had done a great Dark paperback of the Legion, but it was
Ronin.
It wasn't of the flavor that we were currently producing. It was this had become a famous story out of the history of it. So here's the compiled famous story 5 or 6 years later. Mm-hmm. Doll's House is the first time that if you like this, you can start buying the regular monthly comic. You can connect to this. And, it was different from the present model in that we didn't start with the first issue.
Yep.
It was kind of crazy when you think about it.
It's insane.
Well, it is insane.
And it worked.
I was reading this last time, like, I said, I know it made sense at the time, but when you think about it, who the hell collects a story as a book? Who does the first volume starting with issue 8? But the logic at the time, again, all goes back to this Rolling Stone thing. Michael Gilmore was doing this piece, What's Hot in Comics. Sam was going to be featured. And we wanted to get a book in an accessible storyline out there into the world. And because Death in issue 9, Neil? No, 8. Because Death made her appearance in issue 8. And we hadn't even thought about collecting them because, again, you just didn't collect stuff back then. Yep. We decided to start, we said, okay, well, Death is, this is a new character, the story is so different in many ways from the first arc. And you, as Brian, you were saying before, you could hand issue 8 to anybody who didn't read comics, and they'd say, wow, this is like, hey, I want more of this. And issue 9 was the same thing. Issue 9 was, what's the name of that story? Sound of Her Wings, right? Sound of Her Wings. Yeah. And then the Doll's House storyline itself just was, again, didn't have any DC continuity. You didn't have to know any of the mystery and horror characters that Neil had used in the first storyline of the book. So it's like, okay, well, let's get this, let's do this collection, because I think our goal, at least my goal was, this is an opportunity to get people who don't normally read comics, or people who hadn't read comics in a long time want to come back to it. But we want to show them, how literary comics could be, how inventive comics can be on their own. I mean, Sandman 8, Sandman 9, The Doll's House, you weren't relying on any characters that were created before, as were in the previous issues to help launch the book. And so that's kind of why we did it. And I think we made the right decision, though. And in retrospect, I'm like, God, that was kind of crazy. But
Yeah.
it really did make sense. And I'm really glad it did.
It's important also to put it sort of in the chronological context, because 1989 had been really a watershed year for the comic book business. Whether you loved the Tim Burton first Batman movie or you didn't, that movie basically doubled the size of the direct market.
Yep.
Because it drove a lot of customers into comic shops, because it was the successful movie that year, and there wasn't a lot of true mass merchandise. So it wasn't that you could go into Walmart and get a Batman fix. There was very little there to go. You went to the comic shops. It was one of maybe the only occasion I can recall in my career when the head of Marvel called me up to thank me for something we had done. We were coming off that, and that gave us a belief that there were new people interested in reading comics. We'd had to print an astronomical number of Batman graphic novels, reprinting, so the obvious important suspects of that period. But the idea of the graphic novel had started to have a little bit of momentum between what had happened with Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, Mouse, not any relationship to us, and the Batman movie had built on that. So do we have something else? We have an opportunity. Rolling Stone's going to reach that wider audience. It's going to say something about it. Maybe we've got something here, and maybe we can connect to that kind of audience in the process.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I mean, it changed I'd say the success of the graphic novels also, it's so weird. I look back on Sandman, and it took us, until about issue 50-ish, I think, or maybe issue somewhere in our 40s to break 100,000 copies. We were almost never, until the very final issues, anywhere but somewhere in the top 100 of comics. We were not, we weren't this commercial thing that we are remembered as being. Mm-hmm. We were in your store, Brian. You were weird. And we were
hand selling it. We literally, every customer who came in, were like, buy this, and it worked,
exactly.
Because it was a good thing for them to read.
So 20 years ago, which means God knows what the numbers are now. Actually, 17 years ago, I sat down in Paul's office, and we decided to figure out at that point how many copies of Sandman had sold. And Paul was like, okay, I'm going to give you my numbers, but they may not actually quite align with any royalty. And I'm like, no, I just want to know. Let's figure out what we've sold. And we sat there and we came up with numbers that were kind of shocking. I mean, and one of the things that I realized at the time, and I went, okay, well, if this were translated into comics, how many comics would we have to have sold while it was coming out to be here? And at the time, my recollection is it was 4 million copies of every issue. Wow. And that was 17 years ago. Now you're probably looking at 8 to 10 million copies of each issue. If you sort of squeeze what we've sold in trade paperbacks back into the idea of it as a monthly thing. So that's what we, in terms of cultural impact going on from there, I go, okay, that we did good. And that was all because of the trade paperbacks, because of the books, because we were reaching an audience that other people weren't reaching. But also it meant that we were reaching an audience of readers. So I remember being mocked in the early 90s. Mocked is possibly too strong a word, but definitely I had retailers expressing their dissatisfaction with Sandman to me because people only bought one copy to read. And these people would come in and they'd buy one copy to read. And as far as these guys were concerned, you wanted to sell a box of 25 to kids who would put them under their bed and never read them and never open them and never breathe on them because the value might somehow drop or whatever. And Sandman, these guys were just coming in and buying it and they were reading it and they were back next month. But for fuck's sake, Gaiman,
Yeah. Yeah. No. It was a different world. I often say that almost every comic shop exists because the owner wanted a clubhouse they could hang out in.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they wanted. They didn't really. The selling was kind of secondary to it, right? They wanted to have the environment that they wanted to be in, and Sandman was not the environment that most stores. They didn't understand why these women were coming into their store asking for this thing.
They were not.
Hey, that's great. Let's make this clubhouse for everybody. And you need books that are aimed at people to be able to do that.
I would get these lovely, baffled comic shop owners come up to me at San Diego Comic Con and just say, I gotta shake your hand, man. You brought women into my store. And it was just like, sweep the floor. Maybe they'll come back.
Yeah. Exactly.
But you have a combination of two things going on. One, this was literally a case of if you make it the right way, maybe they'll come. Maybe they will show up. Neil's work attracted a significantly different audience than we had seen in comics for a very long time.
Yeah.
The other, and really maybe the broadest lasting impact of Sandman was it really started in the trades to behave the way the book business does. Every time we'd put out a new one, the previous volumes would jump up in sales. The same way that if you put out a new John Grisham, some people check out the earlier books that he had done. And that's really where you get the model that enabled things to work and where it really became a forever good. Sandman is still, I think, extraordinary in the degree that it continues to sell. Neil's other work in other media and other forms obviously is a tremendous part of that. He's had so much success that goes beyond what any other comic book writer of that period has achieved. But that body of material has stayed state of the art, for lack of a better way of looking at it.
And I think so much of that also, Paul, I think a lot of that is Sandman, not me. Because, you can line up my graphic novels that were published with my name on them in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And, I'm incredibly proud of Mr. Punch still. But
I love Mr. Punch.
I think it's wonderful, but it sold a tiny fraction of what Sandman has sold. Sandman is special. And, I love the weirdest thing for me right now is having to come to terms with the fact that it is of its time. Making the Audible series, we absolutely decided, good, we are setting this in September 1988. That's when we're going to begin it, because that was when the original one began, and we're going to be in that time period. Making the Netflix series, we made the same decision the other way. and went, okay, it's going to happen now. It's going to be in a world with phones, and it's going to be in this world. What does that mean? We're not going to do it as a period piece. And I'm loving both.
Yeah, you would.
I
have to imagine
I
that
still
changes it.
believe, I
Go
still
ahead.
believe the argument I made to you that day at Symphony Space, that what you did is you created a true modern mythology. We toss around the term mythology for the superheroes, but in fact, mythology is about explaining the things in the world, the universe, that scare and bewilder us. And when you think about that with endless characters, those are really the forces that are particularly scary and bewildering for young adults. You're coming into your own college age, the idea of what your destiny is, what your dream is, what your desires are, what you're doing to yourself with delirium, perhaps, and the destruction that the world may face. All of those things are really very primal forces to that generation. And maybe right now you would add disease to it, but
begins with a D.
You may have claimed it only because you were looking for things that began with a D, but the divine inspiration that was underlying it was you really somehow grasped how those forces fit together in people's heads.
I think the magic of making comics, or one of the magic things of making comics, is that you're doing things at a speed that forces you to go with your first best idea.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get time to rethink. If you're rethinking or changing things, you're doing it on the fly. You are grabbing everything that comes in and going, everything you see, everything that passes you. And David Bowie once described himself as a photocopier. And I kind of know what he meant for that time period, because everything he saw that he loved, you do that and you incorporate it and you grab it. And anything that passed me that I thought was cool, it was like, good, I'm having that. Any artist I could work with, I was just like, good, who are you? What do you like drawing? What can we do? What can we do together that's cool? And I didn't have time to second guess myself, because if I stopped too long, there would be an artist who wouldn't be able to pay their rent, a letterer who couldn't pay his rent, a colorist who couldn't pay their rent.
Books late. Yeah, we had to get books out. We're in a monthly schedule. In those days, you did not miss a month. You just didn't. Just
and the other thing that I think is really unique about Sandman that is very different than its contemporary peers is that collaboration, that you're working with different artists on a really regular, constant basis. When we look at the other Vertigo comics of the time, it's generally the same creative team for the most part. There's fill-in issues, but Sandman was never fill-in issues. They were all fill-in issues in that sense.
If things had gone according to the original plan, Sam Keith would have been penciling, Mike Dringenberg would have been inking. That would have happened forever.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, we were on Sandman 3, and Sam Keith phoned me up and said, I feel like Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles. I'm in the wrong band. I need to stop. And we asked Mike if Mike tried out. He did a page. We loved it. And so we got Sam to agree to do up to issue 5. Mike started at issue 6, and Malcolm Jones, Karen said to me, who could ink? And I said, what about Malcolm Jones? And she said, hang on, he's walking past. Hold on a sec. Yep, he's in. And that was the speed with which that happened. But
Oh, we
then
did
we were in a world. It was. But then we were in a world very quickly in which it became apparent that Mike Dringenberg couldn't draw, comfortably hit a monthly deadline always. And also sometimes we wanted to do things like, you know, the collector's issue, which was an extra length issue. So we needed to find time for him to do that. He was starting to burn out monthly. And we sort of looked at this, and when we got Kelly Jones, we weren't looking at Kelly as the new Sandman artist who will be on it forever. We were looking at, okay, we'll do this storyline with Kelly. And then when he's done, we'll do some short stories with different people, and then we'll find somebody else. And, you know, it turned out to be Sean McManus, and then Jill Thompson, and you know, they each, and so it became a different way of doing it. It became a way where you try and work, or I would try and write to an artist's strengths, and I would have long conversations with Karen. I mean, probably the longest conversations that we had overall were always just talking about what I wanted to do next and who we could get to draw it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the only one who we didn't get was Mike Mignola was meant to draw the Kindly Ones. Mm-hmm. And Mike Mignola was meant to draw the Kindly Ones at a time when I had pitched the Kindly Ones to him as I thought it would be 3 issues. So, and by the time we got there, I was pretty sure A, it wasn't going to be 3 issues, and B, Mike, I think Hellboy was happening. He was, he was busy, and you know, and we got Mark in instead, Mark Hempel, and I, you know, Mark was the artist who was most divisive, which fascinates me now, because the Kindly Ones is probably the highest scoring, most popular, most beloved of all the graphic novels. But at the time it was like you have to go into Mark's style and be willing to live there through to the end of the book. And it does creep up on you. And once it works, it works. But I think coming back there once every 4 to 6 weeks was not a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I would make the argument that Sandman probably couldn't have worked if it wasn't serialized. Like if the idea was to do, not that there were graphic novels then made in that fashion, but it would never have taken off, right? If you had just done straight books, would you agree with that premise?
We wouldn't
have had the feedback. Yeah. One of the great things about Sandman was letters page feedback, was feedback from retailers, was, you know, I remember doing a signing in Comix Experience, and people saying to me, what are you going to do next? And I said to them, well, the next one is going to be the Orpheus. I'm going to do an Orpheus story. But in the days before the internet, what was great is people would ask you questions and you just answer. There was you didn't need to sort of hide spoilers. So it's like, who's the missing brother? Oh, that's Destruction. You know, you just tell people. And I remember saying, I'll be doing Orpheus next. And everybody in the signing line who I would tell that I was going to do Orpheus said, oh, who's Orpheus? And I had a whole story planned, which was like sort of jazz improv on the Orpheus story. And by the end of that signing, I realized that nobody would know the story I was doing my jazz improv on, so I better just tell it straight. And that was why the Song of Orpheus is the straightest, least, you know, it doesn't do any clever things. It just tells the story completely straight, because I needed people to know the story for the rest of the story to work. And that came from that one signing in your store.
Wow, that's neat.
I want to go back to your question, though, Brian, about the graphic novel versus the comic.
Yeah.
Because I think besides the feedback part of it, the fact that it was a monthly comic meant that it lived in people's lives continuously. You know, we can't underestimate the power of that. You know, today you have creative people who are really good at working social media, creating constant presence. Neil has been extraordinary at that at points in his career. But the power of monthly comics, when they work in a beautiful fashion, as Sandman did, is you pick it up, you read it, maybe you reread it, you're thinking about the next issue. If it's a multi-part story, maybe you reread 2 or 3 before you go back. If we had done the graphic novels, the gap of 6 months, a year between individual elements of it would not have built passion the same way. They might have won the same awards. They might have been regarded as the same brilliant efforts, but I don't think you could have built the emotional charge of the energy. When is it happening? Who's going? And I think the changes in the artist is a part of that too. Who's going to draw the next arc? How will this surprise me? You know, one of the enduring strengths of genre fiction is that people want something that is simultaneously familiar and surprising. And the way Neil and Karen and the team built Sandman absolutely had that power. You were being surprised by the kinds of stories. Wait a minute, this one's taking place in Shakespeare's time. Now we're in the time of Harun al-Rashid. Now we're in Augustus Caesar. How do we go from one place to another, one time to another? Who's drawing it? What's happening here? Yeah. That was a constant charging of energy that kept people excited by what was going on. And they obviously still love it in the graphic novels, but they're now able to find those graphic novels where if they want to binge read them, they can binge read them. But the myth of Sandman, the passion of Sandman, built vastly better coming out on a more or less monthly schedule for whatever that was, 6-7 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it also allows the production of work in an affordable fashion. You know, the fact that we got 75 issues of Sandman that were, let's call them $2 each. You know, as opposed to getting $25 hardcovers, right? Like, it just made it more accessible. It made it so that people walking in off the street could go, oh yeah, I can get this. Is great. It's like buying a gallon of milk. You know, I love serialization. It's strength. Yeah. So let's talk about maybe the beginning of Vertigo, because obviously Sandman was one of the sort of key components to put the whole line together. Do you want to talk a little bit about it, Karen, Paul, about what you guys were thinking to take all of these disparate things and put them together in a single line? Other than it's an obvious idea. Okay.
It's all her fault.
You let me do it. So you asked me to do it, actually. You know, I was on maternity leave with Zach, my first kid, who's almost 30, believe it or not. And I get a call from Dick Giordano, who said, hey, you know, you want to come in and talk to Jeanette and Paul and me, and you know, we just want to talk to you about what you're doing. Really like all the books you've been doing, but come on, let's talk about when you come back from maternity leave. You know how you can kind of do more of what you've been doing. So we had a really casual conversation about how you know, the sort of proto Vertigo books back then. There was kind of the you know, the in-joke name, the Berger books, as people called them in the industry. And I kind of filed that away for whatever, 25, 30 years later, and made a real thing at a different company. But at the time, you know, Paul and Jeanette and Dick said to me, hey, you have these books, you have Swamp Thing and Sandman and Shade the Changing Man and Aloe Man and Doom Patrol and Hellblazer. I can't forget Hellblazer. And you know, retailers, you know, love this stuff. You built, you know, a whole new audience here, and there's like a groundswell for more of this kind of material. So how would you like your own imprint? And, you know, in a heartbeat, I said yes. And they're like, okay, well, you know, go home, you know, take some time, come up with a business plan and send it to us. And, you know, we'll see how it goes. And I put together, I still have that business plan. I actually pulled it out fairly recently when I was cleaning up. And it was only a few pages, but, you know, I had a handful of titles outside of the core 6, stuff that I'd already been working on. Anyway, Sandman Mystery Theater with Matt Wagner and Guy Davis was one of the books at the time. And Death, I guess, was one of the, now Neil, you would remember this since you remember everything. Was Death, were we doing Death anyway, or did we decide to do Death specifically for Vertigo?
No, we were doing Death anyway.
We were, okay.
And it was one of those wonderful serendipities where you said, hang on, we're gonna be launching this thing, let's keep Death and launch that. So it came out as, you know, in Vertigo tranche 1.
And that it was also the same time that Enigma and Sebastian, the whole Touchmark comics, the Disney, you know, for 5 seconds, we're going to do mature readers comics because they saw what we were doing at DC, and they had hired Art Young to go over to Disney, and he, you know, called up his old DC friends and Milligan and Grant and Mark DeMatteis and then Disney, I think. Forget the guy's name Paul was talking about with Richard before. I guess called you up and said, I don't think we want to do these comics after all. You know, can we sell them back to you? So that was also the same time. It was kind of a great, you know, time. We got Enigma at the time, Sebastian O, Mercy, and I'm forgetting a couple of other books too. So it was
we had 4 things.
Yeah, there were 4 things. Yeah. And Shadows Fall, I thought was the other one. Yeah, John Van Fleet, John A. Reber. Yeah. So, but yeah, so it was just kind of I kind of said to people that Vertigo was kind of a master plan, but the books that kind of the core books that made up Vertigo, the core 6, all sort of developed organically. And but the thing that I did have in my business plan, which is also kind of crazy now when I think about it, and the fact that I pulled up for so many years and that Paul let me do it, was that my plan was every month we're going to release 2 new series, you know, not always monthlies, you know, it was obviously because then we totally explode. But you know, either miniseries or a graphic novel or even a collection, and one would be a weird take on a DC character because that's what, you know, how we started the line, but we just started doing create our own books then too. And my goal was always for Vertigo to ultimately be a create our own line, and it pretty much was by the time that I left. And the goal then was, okay, so we do 2 books, one would be create our own and one would be, you know, a word take in the DC character. And yeah, we did that for a long time.
Yeah.
Until it became pretty much all creator owned, except for Hellblazer. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
just a long running book. Yeah.
Super curious about the moment in time where Neil was given creator control over things which were company owned. In terms of, I'm going to end this. It's you know, like you actually had the ability to say, no, you can't. We're not going to use characters. We're not going to use death in other comics, right? So how did the calculus of that happen? Because that was not a thing that happened, right, Paul?
So, you know, there's several levels to a question like that. It's not that the company ever did a deal with Neil that said, you shall have the right to control all of these things that we own because you are handling them better than we are. My memory is that the pivotal moment was, I think it was around issue 35. We were doing 12-issue contracts with Neil to write Sandman. And we were up for the next one. And he said, you know, I'd like to keep writing it. I have a story in mind. I have an ending in mind. At that point, I think his theory was he was going to end as of issue 50. But really, I can't in good conscience sign on to do this unless I know that when it ends, because I really have a true ending in mind. Now, that was completely contrary to our logic as a periodical publisher. If we had a book that was succeeding and the creator left the book for some reason, either in anger or because they had other opportunities or they were bored, you slotted somebody else in. Maybe they could keep it going. Maybe they couldn't, and you'd have a slow death thereafter. But we had never agreed to anything like that before. And I very vividly remember sitting with Jeanette, having the conversations about it and arguing, perhaps, please don't take this as too overtly egotistical, but you know, I'm a mainstream comics writer in those years. I could jump in on almost any title we were doing and not get laughed at. It would be okay for the time. There was no way in hell I could jump in and do Sandman. There was no way in hell anyone could jump in and do Sandman. So the question was, either we could agree to Neil's request and get the benefit of his staying through all of it, or we could wait until he was leaving. Maybe he would stay till beyond issue 50 or stay to issue 50 anyway. You never could tell if there was a level of bluff in it. And we'd never be able to find anyone who could really step in and execute it anyway. So let's respect it. Beyond that, you get to the point where, as Neil became not just an incredible writer in the field, but an incredible marketer and public figure, he had a loyal audience. There were a group of people who respected him and really would be following what he said out there. And if we went ahead and we did things that Neil didn't like, he was an honest enough person that he would say that, not in a mean way to the audience, not, you know, stay the hell away from this because I think it's awful, but just, it's not mine, and it's not something I really love. And that would cause it to crash and burn anyway. So out of respect for what he had accomplished, and out of respect for his power over his core audience, it made perfect business sense to give him a higher level of authority. I don't know that in the time after I was at DC, some of that may have become contractual in some fashion. I know he had an arrangement with the company for those Sandman universe books that he was, quote unquote, curating in some fashion. But at least in my time, it really was a question of respect. And I think Neil had a relationship with Karen, with Jeanette, with me, where he trusted us to protect his work and deal properly with it. And to call him and say, hey, we want to do this thing, I think it's a good idea. And to really have respect for how he felt about that. You know, he had earned that on every level, commercially, creatively, and by thinking about the material in a different way. I mean, Neil, of all the writers that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years in comics, Neil was by far both the smartest instinctive marketer on every possible level and the most curious about the business side of the business. You know, he'd come in with idea after idea about how the work could be marketed. Some of them were years ahead of where the marketplace was and things that we would ultimately be able to do years later. Some of them were spot on for the moment. But he was, whether it was with Bruce Bristow, who had been our head of marketing for a number of years, Bob Wayne, who was head of sales, later did marketing job, with me in conversation, with Karen. He was always totally involved in all of that in the smartest of ways. And most writers, if they were involved in marketing, really were just coming in saying, you should do more. Can you give me a poster every month? Can you do this sort of, can you do more of what you're doing for everybody else? Neil was coming in with fresh new ideas and really wanted to know why it worked and why it didn't work, and probably calling you and other retailers up who he had relationships with and saying, does this thing that DC's talking about make any sense? Is it working in your store? What can you tell me? What can you tell me about it? He was doing his homework on every level in a way that I've never seen a writer do.
Yeah.
Also, I was very, very willing to be wrong. Yeah. Which was incredibly useful. I remember Brian and I both agreed that Sandman month was a terrible idea. And Sandman month was the one where DC, during the course of 1 month, brought out the statue you talked about, that the Kelly Jones statue, the done by Randy Bowen, the a death watch, a slipcase, and published 2 books, yeah, and had a poster, Kelly Jones poster, and they all came out at the same time. And it was, and I remember Brian calling me up and going, there's like, $300 worth of Sandman merchandise coming out in 1 month. This is crazy, Neil. And I'm like, and I went to you guys and said, this is crazy. Why aren't we spreading this stuff out? Why are we trying to do this in a month? And at the end of Sandman month, when sales on everything had exceeded everybody's expectations, and when everything that had been just traveling along had also just moved straight up a notch, I was like, oh, okay. You need to be a big enough bowling ball to make a dent on the rubber sheet. And actually, that was what we did. We got that, as Paul was saying earlier, we got the retailer's attention in a way we wouldn't have done if we'd taken all of this stuff. So for me, that was, I loved being wrong. Because I'd learned something, and that was fascinating. I also came into it having watched Alan Moore's leaving mainstream comics, very, sadly, angrily, leaving mainstream comics. And that was as I was coming in going, okay, well, maybe this relationship will go horribly wrong, but let me do it right as I go. And I did things that, in retrospect, were obviously incredibly unusual. Like, I would read my contracts. And I only say that that's incredibly unusual because, 5 years ago, there was a point where I got to call DC and say, you're doing this thing that you can't do. And they were like, no, we can absolutely do this thing that we've just done, which screws you over, but we can do it. And I'm like, actually, there is a tiny clause in an obscure contract of mine that says you can't. And they're like, no such clause exists. And I went off and I'm just telling my agent, I remember this clause. It does exist. And I went off, and eventually it took like 4 months of going through every single piece of paper. And it turned out that it wasn't even in a contracts drawer. It was in a letters from DC drawer, because the first 3 pages were a letter from Chantal Donis, and then it became a sort of contract at the end. But it had this little clause that I remembered existing, and I showed it to DC, and they were like, oh, okay, you can have whatever you want. Do you want, it's candy. We're sorry. And it was, but it was fascinating to me. And it was like, okay, well, I read my contracts when they came through, and I remembered them because I figured my contracts were going to be hugely important to me down the line. And this thing that I was signing was big and important. And I really wanted to know, and I didn't feel like there was anything wrong as an artist in understanding what the contract you've signed said. Just as I did a year on Sandman, and then I wrote a letter to Paul and Chantal and Jeanette, and I said, hi guys, can we make my deal better now? And because I was like grumpy, the deal that I had wasn't a very good one. And I wrote a very nice letter explaining why I thought my deal should actually be better. And, you know, a month later, got a letter back from Chantal saying, yeah, you're right. Okay, so we're going to give you this, and we're going to give you this. And now you're going to get a creative by credit, and we're going to give you this stuff. And nothing was ever done in a sort of, was never done in anger. It was never particularly done in any kind of holding DC up kind of way or whatever. It was just like, okay, we're grown up, so obviously everything can always be negotiated. So we did year one, that was great. How are we going to do year two?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when you sent that letter, Neil, the essence of it was, we did a deal when Sandman started where you were going to do a lot of stuff from DC universe. And that first incarnation, beginning story, was very nested in it and built on it very strongly. And we had done a deal that sort of said, okay, for a new character set within the DC universe, using an old name, using some old ideas, but with some new stuff, this is worth X. And your letter was basically, well, guys, if you've been reading the book, you've noticed that, in fact, I ended up doing something that is genuinely new and that I think is kind of important. And it clearly was. So can I have the new and clearly important kind of deal? And, you know, Ned and I and Chantal, and who Karen certainly would have been supportive of more for the talent in almost any circumstance. So, you know, she was an easy and consistent voice in anything like that. But those of us who were supposed to be the purse string holders and the cheap bastards said, no, he's right. You know, this is something new. This is something potentially important. It should treat it that way. So that was very easy to give you what you wanted, because what you wanted made perfect sense and you made a great case for it. You know,
did the work change as a result, Neil? Did you?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it changed in that it only changed in that had DC said no, I might well have stopped. But I never presented it to them as a sort of a say yes or I'll stop. It was, and part of that was just because I knew how much of a labor of love Sandman was for me. I knew that it was taking me, you know, in the beginning, it would take me 2 weeks out of every month. By the time I finished, it was taking me 5 weeks a month to write.
Yeah.
Other stuff wasn't getting done. And, you know, my goal in terms of being paid for a Sandman was one day to make as much as the writer as Dave McKean did for painting one of the covers.
That was the worst thing I learned my lesson then, Neil. I don't know why I ever told you how much Dave made.
I think David told me how much he did. You did.
I remember whatever. No, I remember telling you actually.
But it was actually a really good, you know, and
yeah.
But no, and I loved having Dave. I was very, very aware that having Dave on covers was the public face of Sandman. I remember the time you fired Dave and from Sandman, and by the time you fired Dave before the Doll's House, and he'd done Sandman #9, and you phoned him up. I was in New York at the time. In fact, I'd just done, I think, the signing with those Sandman 8s at Brian's store. You had told me that actually Dave needed to do, I think it was Arkham or something. He was late on something. You needed to find the time for him. And you phoned him and told him he was off. And by the time I arrived home, he'd done the next 3 Sandman covers and sent them off to you.
No, I never.
Which were those
I
those
never,
tiny little ones.
No, I never fired him. No, I never fired him. I think
That
I
was
might
Dave's
have.
story.
Yeah, no, I think maybe I said I had to bring someone in for a couple of issues because he was too busy. But it was never like you're off the covers. I never did that.
No,
I never did
I
that.
just
Yeah.
what
it makes a
all I
better
remember
story the
is
other way though.
it
I do
is a better
remember
story.
him
But
yeah, I do remember doing like 4 covers. Like
I just remember him presenting you with all of the. I think he may have presented you with all of the covers that he would have been off the book for. He just, which I think was
that he did, but I didn't fire him. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, it is a better story. So I agree.
It is.
I agree. It's a better story.
Well, sometimes the better story is the most one.
Exactly. He's a storyteller. Of course, he's going to say that, right? Make it sound better. Yeah.
Oh man.
When I was, can I say something?
Please.
No, because when I was reading Doll's House again, in preparation for this, and it has been decades since I read it, it was so much fun because I was totally reading it objectively. I was almost approaching it like I hadn't read it before, and it was a really great experience. And I not only was I struck by how timeless it is, and I can say this as a person who worked on this when we first did it, and trying to be, kind of the, unattached to it all, just reading something new. There's such a timeless quality to it. It does not, it reads as fresh and as it did when I think you sent me the script, Neil. The scripts on these issues, and I was also struck by Mike Dringford's layouts. They were really, he did such beautiful storytelling and really pushed boundaries in many ways. And I was struck by Malcolm's inking. God, he was so good. He really he was such a wonderful illustrator, Malcolm, and you could tell when he would get lost in a face and render it so beautifully, and it brought back so many great memories for me reading it. So I had this, it was kind of this weird sort of out of body experience. One hand I'm there, the other hand I'm trying to read like I'm not there. But I was, I was just really taken by it, which sounds kind of strange, I guess, for me to say that. But made me feel good. And there are a lot of funny bits in here, Neil. I forgot how funny you were too. So a lot of funny bits.
You used to be funny.
So yeah, you used to be funny.
Funny. I've been, if it's any consolation, I've been having a very similar experience recently because particularly with the Audible adaptations, where I had to read and correct and go through, another 40 issues of Sandman, and I'd be reading them, and sometimes I would find that I didn't remember how that story went, and it would take me by surprise, or I'd just get sort of swept up into the beats of the story, and I would be like, "Oh, you did something really clever then, young Neil."
Right.
I love that.
Young man. Yeah.
It's really fun to. You don't often get. I don't think I could do it with the comics, because beat by beat, panel by panel, I remember all of those comics and every effort that went into them, and And on the other hand, talking to Dirk Maggs, the lovely audio director, the other day, we just finished 3 Septembers in January. You were on maternity leave, so you missed this. Poor Tom Pyer got the brunt of it from me. but I phoned. I just remember getting the black and white, the photocopy of 3 Septembers in January, and phoning Tom and saying, "This is so bad, it's not publishable. We just have to skip a month. We just don't publish this. Let's just drop it. We'll pretend it never existed. I'm really sorry. I'll write an extra issue further up the line." And Tom humored me, and at least said, that isn't really going to happen, Neil, but thank you for calling. And and now, and we went through it, and I was the narrator for it, and I thought, what a lovely, beautiful, moving, funny, lovely story this is. Why did I think that this was the worst? This was so unpublishably bad it would destroy Sandman, and I don't know, but I did.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay.
It's got to be an interesting experience revisiting some of these stories because, I mean, particularly in this first volume, they're a little clunky, they're a little chunky. Yep. I was struck particularly listening to the audibles of how well they work as radio plays because they're so periodically structured, right? They're structured as a self-contained thing. That I'm curious is if that will still continue to work when we get to something like Kindly Ones, where it's a serial, as opposed to self-contained things. And there are bits that are adapted that, I think particularly like the Little Nemo stuff, like it kind of doesn't work as anything other than a comic book, the choices that are made there for what you keep and what you lose. How hard is it to make those choices?
It's always absolutely fascinating. Watching dailies, watching rough cuts of episodes coming in right now for TV. I'm going always into this is what we could do. This is what made comics. This is what made comics so amazingly special. Is the point where I can, Sam Keith is sad doing Sandman, so I will cheer him up by saying, "Sam, draw demons from horizon to horizon. We'll do a double-page spread. You're just doing demons. Every single one of them looks different." And Sam was so happy he inked that double-page spread himself. That is Sam Inks. And I love that. I love the things that make comics. The moment, the end of Dr. D, the relentless beat of 24 hours. 24 hours as TV is relentless and moving and all sorts of things, but you can't get that sense of we're checking in once an hour.
Yeah.
That you do in the comic, and you can't really get the sense of who these characters are. You're not allowed to just have a narrator who stands off to one side and says, "Betts realized the real problem with stories is that if you keep them going long enough, they always end in death." If you're going to use that line, you have to give it to one of the characters.
Right.
So it's a different kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, it seems like that's an interesting challenge.
But for me, I mean, the most interesting thing of all of this is that Paul and Karen and I have spent the best part of just under 30 years trying to corral Sandman adaptations that never happened and trying to stop them from being bad.
Yeah.
And trying to encourage them into being good and trying to stop them when they went too far off the rails and all of that kind of stuff. And, I remember some years ago, Paul and I going to to Warner Brothers to do a presentation to the then heads of Warner Brothers, and we had all the Sandman statues and busts, and we had John Watkiss and Jill Thompson do special art for the whole thing. Exactly. And we did this giant presentation for how you could do Sandman. The Matrix had just happened, so this was how you could do Sandman as 3 movies and a bunch of sort of, you know, animated things that we'd release between movies or whatever. And we got to the end, and Paul, I will never forget this. The one head of, at that time, there were 2 heads of Warner Brothers, and one of them turned to the other and then turned to us and said, "Thank you for the presentation, gentlemen. You know, person here and I had lunch the other day because we figured that we needed to work out why our most successful films, being the Harry Potter series and Lord of the Rings, were so successful. And we figured it out over lunch. It's because both of them have clearly defined bad guys. Does the Sandman have a clearly defined bad guy?" And I said, no, it doesn't. And they said, "Well, thank you so much for coming in and for this entertaining presentation." And Paul and I went away going, "What the fuck was that?" The truth is that, you know, I love the fact that all of those Sandman things didn't happen, because we finally reached a point where we can do things like the Audible adaptation. And, you know, the Audible adaptation broke records for Audible. It was the fastest selling thing they've ever released. It sold faster and more than Harry Potter books. It did this amazing thing for them. You know, Netflix's commitment to doing the Sandman TV series is huge and outstanding. And we're in a place right now where this stuff can happen, and it couldn't really have ever happened in, I think, in 2005 or 1996 or any of the other times.
I have to get my charger. Sorry.
No problem. Do you think that one of the things about Sandman is the change of Sandman himself, or itself, I suppose. He changes based upon who's viewing him. He changes based on the story, who's drawing him as well. Is something like that lost in a television, in a filmed adaptation, where it's kind of got to stay the same through the whole thing? Does that make sense? Did that parse as a question?
Wait and see.
Okay.
Going back to what you were saying before, Brian, a minute ago. Sometimes the most important things you do are what you do. And many of the decisions that I'm proudest of, and the things that we worked the hardest on, not just me and Karen and Neil, Jeanette Kahn. Jeanette spent a lot of time killing bad movies that never got made. You know, it's not always easy to do that. And I vividly remember one with a Oscar award-winning screenwriter and occasional director bitching loudly at me, saying, "You know how hard it is to get a movie made, and you just killed this thing I want to do." Yes, we did, because it was not the right thing to do. And yes, we would have made some money if you made it. Maybe made some more money if actually you were right and people came in, but it wasn't the right thing for what the essence of the property was. And you know, we all tried with those things in mind. And you know, Karen was enormously feared in the halls because she was such a strong protector of the creative talent that worked for her. And we each in our own individual way tried to protect these beautiful things that had happened. You know, when you start out trying to do the projects, as I said before, you know most of them are going to fail. Most of them are not going to be something that will last. And when you do get the the beauty, the magic coming together, the lightning in a bottle, you just want to keep that sacred in the bottle. And maybe someday it'll get out of the bottle on the right day. And I think Neil's points about how the world is ready for it right now and wasn't ready. We were trying to make it ready and we couldn't. Now it's ready. That's great. It'll be great fun to turn that on and watch.
Yeah.
I also took a huge amount of what's the right word? I watched what happened with the Howard the Duck movie. And I had loved the Howard the Duck comics. They, the kidney lady, I bought them excitedly and I'd loved them and I'd love what they did. And I was really excited for the Howard the Duck movie. And I watched this bad thing come out, and suddenly you were in a world in which Howard the Duck was a punchline. It was a punchline used to talk about bad movies. And I would run into people who were genuinely baffled that I would fight to stop bad movies of my stuff being made. Because they were like, but you'll make, hundreds of thousands of dollars or more. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't want Sandman ever to be a punchline. And there were versions of Sandman. There were scripts that crossed my desk that were Howard the Duck level bad. There was one which was, I never read the whole thing. I got up to about page 30 and I was feeling so unwell that I just flipped through the rest of the pages to see, and saw a few lines, and it was just like, oh, okay, whoever wrote this has never read Sandman. They've never read a Sandman script. They've been, this is one of those where John Peters has dictated an incoherent plot to somebody with giant spiders and a race against time for the millennium, and Lucifer and Morpheus and the Corinthian were identical brothers, and they all have to get the Sandman's helm before the millennium. And and it's that sort of thing where you just, all you want is for it to be killed, because if this thing is made, people will think that's what Sandman is, and I just didn't want that.
Yeah.
And I was so lucky in having Karen and in having Paul, who absolutely supported me.
Yeah.
And that was so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd say
it was easy to support you.
The same thing, right? This is really true to the work. I hope that the television show is the same. There's obvious care and love and thought put into this. It's the way it should be. And it's great that we're in a position that you can do that.
It is, and I think it is very much a phenomenon of now.
Yeah.
The world is changing in fascinating ways. But just the fact that I was on New Zealand television last night and somebody produced an absolute Sandman to put in front of the cameras and then got me to sign it. And I'm like, it's this thing that we did that I thought when I was doing it was transient, will outlive me. And I love that. I'm so proud of that.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. This has been a really good conversation. Let's wrap it up. I always have two questions that I ask people. One's just is there something you want to plug, my guests? I'm expecting, Paul, maybe you want to plug your book, Unfinished Business? No?
I'm certainly more than happy to have you plug it. It's the first time I've ever had an original graphic novel in hardcover. It's a rabbi, a priest, and a minister walk into a bar, except they're all dead, and they're there to find out what their unfinished business is. Some lovely art by Cy Frazier, It's a rather strange book, but you might enjoy it.
Yeah, I liked it quite a bit. Karen is Karen's off the screen, so I guess not. Is there anything, Karen, you wanna plug that for Burger Books that you're looking forward to, especially that's coming out in the next bit?
Well, something that just came out that I'd like to plug is Post York, by written and drawn by James Romberger, and it's just a beautifully told, terrifying tale, really about what happens when the polar ice caps melt and what happens to New York. And it's told very sparsely, which is usually what you don't find in a lot of books that I edit. The art is really quite beautiful, and it's a chilling, but sorry, I'm weird with the camera here. Hopeful tale as well. And no, just Burger Books. We got a lot of great stuff coming out, and I'm really happy to be back in comics. It's been a few years, and I always say that if you like what I publish at Vertigo, you'll like what I'm publishing at Burger Books. So yeah, I could plug forever. So yeah, I'll stop. I got a lot of.
You got anything? I mean, I know the Sandman show's coming up. You got any comics coming out? Is Miracle Man coming back? What's going on?
Miracle Man, things are ticking away in the background, but because we got kind of sideswiped a few years ago by legal stuff that held everything up at a point where we all thought we were all systems go. Yeah. We have decided to make sure that every single chicken is in every single basket, and that all of the work is done, and that there is nothing that could possibly go wrong before we say anything in public. But Mark Buckingham is certainly working away, and I'm thrilled that Mark is working away.
That's great.
And what else? I'm loving the Norse mythology graphic novel, and I'm loving it mostly because it's my son Ash's favorite graphic novel, and he not only reads it, he does the voices, because he's heard my audiobook, and his Thor is hilarious. So that's why I'm loving it. It's beautiful. There's some amazing Jill Thompson stuff in there, beautiful Craig Russell's in there, Mike Mignola, so many fabulous people.
It's also Dark Horse, right? Yeah.
It is. It's Dark Horse, and they're doing so well. And the other thing that I would plug, because especially for your book club, is I'm hearing from a lot of people something that I did not expect, which is they are loving the experience of playing the Sandman Audible adaptation with the graphic novels to hand.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
And that makes me really happy, because they're getting sort of something else out of it. So I definitely plug that. It's really proud of the Audible Sandman adaptation, and I love that it can be. Also, just love the fact that people who had either visual issues, which meant that they couldn't literally read comics, or the kind of brain processing issues that means you just look at a page of comics and you don't get a reading experience out of it, are both now able to go and enjoy comics as well as the people who do love comics. They can all access Sandman.
Yeah, and it's not only is it available on Audible, but you can get it as a physical box set here. Stores like mine sell these things. Come buy them from your local.
Absolutely.
That's always what I say.
Great pitch, man, Brian. Yeah.
Definitely.
I gotta. I mean, that's right. You gotta do your bit. So the last point is there's a lot of people who watch this series who are aspiring creators. They want to create. If you had a piece of advice that you would give to an aspiring creator, whether it's physical, whether it's philosophical, just one sentence. What
follow your dreams, and read your contracts.
And read your. I like that. Paul?
Both.
Don't give up. years ago, we had a consulting company come in and analyze how we recruited new talent. And they came up with no useful advice, but they came up with a magnificent metaphor that I've been talking about ever since, which is they said, basically what you do is you ask people to hit their head against a brick wall until the brick wall breaks. At that point, having determined that they're sincere, you check and see if they have any talent. So if you want to be a creative person, you have to be willing to hit your head against the brick wall until the brick wall breaks. And I think that's true for comics, that's true for prose, that's true for acting, pretty much every creative medium. Have a hard head and don't mind the headaches. It's a wonderful thing if you can get through.
Love it. Love it. Karen?
Be true to yourself. Respect others as you would have them respect you. And shoot for the moon.
Yeah. Love it.
I love looking back on it, Karen. It amazes me how many artists we gave their first gig to on Sandman, and how many of them went on to become stellar, and how many of them we've never heard of again. And both of those things happened, and I love that we did both of those things. We would always take a chance on people. We would always, and sometimes if we felt they weren't ready, we'd then keep an eye on them until the point where, like Mike Allred.
Yeah, I knew to say that. I remember
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, yeah.
He just wasn't quite ready for the big time, but he was amazing. But we kept an eye on him, and
I still remember.
as soon as he was ready, it was like, come draw Sandman finally. Do prez.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. I want to thank the three of you for taking your afternoon or evenings to be part of it.
Honey. It's late here.
I do really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And it means something to me. And the work that you guys have helped shepherd means something to me and means something to people. And that's what this is meant to celebrate, is that work. So thank you so much for that. I want to say to everybody, give me a one shot, Jordan. I want to say to everybody who's watching this, if you like this interview, we do these every month. We pick a brand new book every month. We've got the graphic novel of the month club. This is the classic edition, so we're picking books from the whole history of comics. This is this month. Next month we're doing Marvels, and we're talking to Kurt Busiek. We also have a graphic novel of the month club that's brand new material that comes out, exposing new voices, as well as, last we had Barry Windsor Smith, so not exactly a new voice, but next month's book is Delicates. Brenna Thumler is going to be talking to us.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a kids graphic novel of the month club, which is the best possible way to get kids reading and get them excited. Next book that we're doing is Young Shadow. We're talking to Ben Sears next month. So there'll be a link at the bottom, or there has been a link at the bottom that you can come and join the club, hear these conversations. There's a little bell in the top corner that will get you to subscribe to these things if you're interested in ongoing conversations about work. I want to thank my technical director Jordan for running the show. I want to thank The Beat for sponsoring us. I want to thank my staff for being the greatest staff in the world and giving me the freedom to be able to talk about comics in this way. And I want to thank the people who make comics, like these wonderful people here who bring these things to us. We couldn't do it without you. I love you all so much, and I can't wait until this whole disease thing is over and we can see each other, give each other big hugs, because I really, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for everything.
Well, thank you so much.
Part of it, Brian.
Yeah, you really are. You've done so much.
Thank you, Brian.
As a retail, you really, really have.
Yeah, it's all what you guys do. I'm just amplifying what you guys do. I'd say I'm the easy part of the job. Anyway, so this has been the Graphic Novel of the Month Club, and thank you all. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
That was wonderful.
Get us out.